The strangest thing about the day I left for my road trip was that I thought I was driving away from my problems, when in reality, I was driving straight toward the one person who had been quietly carrying a piece of my pain for years. I had one truck, 2 weeks of vacation, a half-packed cooler, and absolutely no plan beyond putting miles between myself and the house where I had once believed my life was perfect. Then, as I was struggling to tie down a suitcase in my driveway, my neighbor stepped outside with a small canvas bag in her hand. I jokingly told her she should come with me. I expected her to laugh. Instead, she looked at me with an expression I will never forget and calmly said, "Okay." The way she said it was not playful. It was not impulsive. It sounded like she had been waiting for me to ask. Before we go any further, if you believe that kindness can find people at their lowest, that forgiveness can heal wounds, and that sometimes a second chance arrives disguised as an ordinary moment, please like this video, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, leave a comment, and subscribe to our channel. You never know when a simple story might remind someone that their life is not over just because one chapter broke their heart. My name is Everett Callahan, and at 42, I had become very good at pretending I was fine. From the outside, my life looked ordinary. I owned a modest house on a quiet street, worked as a regional construction estimator, kept my lawn trimmed, paid my bills, and occasionally grilled burgers for the neighbors when the weather was good. But the truth was that I had spent the previous year slowly disappearing inside myself. My marriage to Marissa had ended after 11 years, not with one dramatic betrayal, but with hundreds of small disappointments that had finally become too heavy to carry. When she left, she took most of the furniture, most of the photographs, and almost all of the confidence I had once possessed. What she could not take was the silence she left behind. Every morning, I woke up expecting to hear another person moving around the kitchen. Every afternoon, I came home to an empty driveway. Every evening, I found some excuse to stay busy until I was too tired to think. I stopped inviting friends over because I hated the sympathetic looks. I stopped talking about the divorce because people always asked whose fault it was, and I no longer had the energy to explain that sometimes two people could hurt each other without either one being completely evil. The only person who seemed to understand the difference between leaving me alone and abandoning me was my neighbor, Celeste Warren. She lived 3 houses away in a small blue cottage with white shutters. She was 38, had soft brown hair that she usually tied loosely behind her neck, and possessed the unusual ability to make silence feel comfortable. We had become neighbors 2 years earlier, but we had never been especially close. We exchanged mail when packages were delivered to the wrong house, helped each other with trash bins, and occasionally talked over the fence. Celeste worked as a freelance interior designer and seemed independent, organized, and almost impossibly calm. But there was something behind her calmness that I had never understood. She had lost her husband, Graham, 3 years before I met her. A sudden illness had taken him after a short hospitalization, leaving her alone in the house they had renovated together. I knew this because she had once mentioned it while we were carrying groceries from her car. I had offered the usual words people say when they do not know what else to say. I was sorry. I could not imagine it. If she ever needed anything, she could ask. She had smiled politely and told me she appreciated it. After that, neither of us mentioned it again. Then came the morning of my road trip. I had decided to drive west without knowing exactly where I would stop. I wanted mountains, open roads, diners, strange little towns, anything that did not remind me of the life I had lost. I was loading my last bag when Celeste appeared on her porch. She wore jeans, a cream-colored sweater, and carried a small canvas travel bag. I looked at her and, without thinking, said that if she was bored, she could join me. I was joking. At least I thought I was. She walked down the steps, crossed the lawn, and stopped beside my truck. Then she said okay. I stared at her. She did not laugh. She did not smile. She simply looked at the open passenger door as though she had already imagined herself sitting there. I asked if she was serious. She nodded. She told me she had not taken a real vacation since Graham died. She said she had spent 3 years telling herself she would travel someday, after work slowed down, after the house felt less empty, after she stopped feeling guilty for enjoying something without him. Then she looked at me and admitted something that changed the entire trip before it even began. She said she had been waiting for someone to give her a reason to leave. I suddenly felt guilty for making the invitation as a joke. But she only smiled and placed her bag in the back seat. Our first few hours on the road were awkward. We talked about harmless things, like gas prices, old movies, restaurants, and the weather. Eventually, though, the silence became easier. Celeste turned the radio down and looked out at the passing fields. I noticed that she kept touching a small silver bracelet around her wrist. I asked about it. She told me it had belonged to Graham. That was when I realized the road trip was not going to be the escape I had imagined. We were not two carefree neighbors going on an adventure. We were two wounded people sitting in the same vehicle, each pretending we were simply traveling. By late morning, we stopped at a small roadside diner. The place smelled like coffee, cinnamon, and fried potatoes. We sat by the window and ordered breakfast even though it was nearly lunchtime. For the first time, Celeste laughed at something I said, and the sound surprised me. It was warm and genuine, the kind of laugh that seemed to come from somewhere she had forgotten existed. I found myself smiling. Then her expression changed. She told me that she had not laughed like that in years. I did not know what to say. She looked down at her coffee and admitted that after Graham died, people had been kind for a few months. Then they gradually stopped asking how she was doing. She said everyone assumed grief had an expiration date. She had learned to smile so people would stop worrying. I understood that better than I wanted to admit. I told her about Marissa. For the first time, I said out loud that I was not angry anymore. I was simply exhausted from feeling like my marriage had failed because I had failed as a person. Celeste reached across the table and rested her hand over mine. She did not give me advice. She did not tell me everything would be okay. She simply stayed there. That small gesture became the emotional center of our journey. As the miles passed, we began sharing pieces of ourselves we had hidden from everyone else. I learned that Celeste had once dreamed of opening a small design studio with Graham. I told her I had abandoned my dream of building custom furniture because Marissa had always considered it impractical. She confessed that she still had unfinished sketches stored in a box beneath her bed. I admitted that I still had the first wooden table I ever built sitting in my garage, covered with a sheet because looking at it reminded me of the person I used to be. Neither of us realized that the other person was quietly giving us permission to become ourselves again. But the trip nearly ended on the second day. We were driving through a rural stretch when Celeste suddenly asked me to pull over. Her face had gone pale. She opened her bag and pulled out an old envelope. Inside was a letter from Graham that she had never been able to read completely. She had carried it with her for 3 years. She told me she was afraid that if she finished reading it, there would be nothing left connecting her to him. I told her that maybe the letter was not meant to keep her trapped in the past. Maybe it was meant to help her leave it. She stared at me for a long time. Then she opened it. I did not read it. I simply sat beside her while she cried. When she finally finished, she folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. She said Graham had written that he wanted her to keep living, even when he was no longer there to see it. She laughed through her tears and said he had always been annoyingly wise. I laughed too. Then she looked at me and told me something that hurt more than I expected. She said I was doing the same thing. I asked what she meant. She said I was keeping my marriage alive by punishing myself for its ending. Those words stayed with me. For the rest of the afternoon, I barely spoke. Eventually, I pulled into a quiet overlook above a wide valley. The sun was beginning to soften the landscape, but it was still bright daylight. We stepped out of the truck and stood beside the railing. Wind moved through the trees below us. I finally admitted that I was afraid to be happy again. Celeste told me she was too. And somehow, standing there with the person I had barely known before the trip, I understood that fear did not mean we had to stop moving. The next morning, we continued west. We visited a small mountain town, bought coffee from a family-owned shop, walked through a local market, and laughed over a ridiculous antique sign neither of us needed. Celeste bought a tiny wooden picture frame. I bought a set of handmade carving tools. She told me I should use them. I told her she should finish her design sketches. We made a promise that sounded simple but changed both our lives. When we got home, we would stop waiting for someday. Weeks later, I returned to my garage and removed the sheet from the old table. Celeste returned to her unfinished sketches. She eventually opened a small design studio. I began making furniture again. Neither of us rushed into a relationship. Neither of us tried to replace the people we had lost. Instead, we learned how to live without apologizing for being alive. Months after our road trip, Celeste and I sat together on my front porch during a bright afternoon, drinking coffee and watching a delivery truck pull up across the street. She looked at me and smiled. I remembered the morning I had jokingly invited her into my truck. At the time, I thought I had been offering her a seat. Now I understood that she had given me one too. She had been waiting for an invitation to leave her grief behind, but I had been waiting for someone to remind me that my life was still waiting for me. Sometimes the person standing quietly beside you is carrying a story you know nothing about. Sometimes a joke becomes an invitation becomes a journey, and a journey becomes the beginning of healing. We had both spent years believing that moving forward meant leaving someone behind. We eventually learned that moving forward could also mean carrying their memory with us while finally choosing to live. Just before the ending, I want to ask you something. Have you ever met someone at exactly the moment when you both needed each other, even though neither of you knew it at first? If this story touched something inside you, leave a meaningful comment and tell us what lesson you took from Everett and Celeste's journey. Your words might be the encouragement another person needs today. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Because sometimes life does not send you the person who will save you. Sometimes it sends you someone who simply sits beside you, listens to your pain, and reminds you that you are strong enough to save yourself. And sometimes, when you finally have the courage to say, "Come with me," the person beside you has been waiting all along to say, "Okay." For a while, Everett believed the hardest part of his life was behind him. He was wrong. Healing had taught him how to breathe again, but it had not taught him what to do when the past came knocking. The first sign came on an ordinary Saturday morning when he was sanding the legs of a walnut table in his garage. Celeste was sitting nearby with a sketchbook open across her knees, working on plans for a client's living room. Sunlight poured through the garage door, illuminating tiny particles of sawdust in the air. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. Then Everett's phone vibrated on the workbench. He glanced at the screen and froze when he saw Marissa's name. For several seconds, he simply stared at it. Celeste noticed his expression but said nothing. Everett finally answered. Marissa told him she needed to see him. Her voice sounded different from the voice he remembered, less confident and more fragile. She explained that after their divorce, she had convinced herself she had made the right decision, but lately she had begun to realize how much of their life together she had taken for granted. She said she had heard that Everett had started making furniture again. Someone had shown her photographs of his work. She wanted to congratulate him. Everett thanked her, but he could feel something uncomfortable settling in his chest. He had spent months learning to stop measuring his worth through Marissa's opinion, yet hearing her praise still affected him. When the call ended, he remained silent. Celeste closed her sketchbook and asked whether he was okay. Everett told her the truth. He said a part of him had wanted Marissa to regret leaving him, and now that she apparently did, he had discovered that it did not feel as satisfying as he had imagined. Celeste smiled sadly and told him that revenge rarely feels good when the person you wanted to hurt is finally hurting. Those words stayed with him. A week later, Marissa appeared at Everett's workshop. She looked tired, but not broken. She apologized for the way she had treated him during the final months of their marriage. She admitted that she had spent too long blaming him for everything because blaming him was easier than admitting that she had also changed. She said she had been unhappy and had convinced herself that leaving would solve everything. Everett listened without interrupting. Then Marissa said something he never expected. She told him she was proud of the person he had become after their marriage ended. Years earlier, those words would have meant everything. Now they simply meant that he could finally let go. Everett forgave her. Not because what happened had been acceptable, but because carrying anger had become heavier than carrying the memory. When Marissa left, Everett stood outside his workshop for a long time. Celeste came out and stood beside him. She did not ask what had been said. She simply waited. Everett finally told her that he had spent years believing closure would come when Marissa understood what she had done to him. Instead, closure had arrived when he realized he no longer needed her to understand. Celeste nodded. She understood. But Celeste's own past was about to demand something from her. A few days later, she received a letter from Graham's sister, Meredith. Meredith explained that she had found an old box of Graham's belongings while cleaning out her parents' house. Inside were photographs, sketches, receipts, and a small notebook filled with plans for the design studio Graham and Celeste had once dreamed of opening. Celeste was shaken. She had thought she had finally learned how to move forward, but the notebook brought everything back. The old dream. The unfinished plans. The life she had imagined before everything changed. She spent the afternoon sitting at her kitchen table, staring at the notebook. Everett found her there. He could see immediately that something was wrong. She showed him the notebook and told him she was afraid of opening the studio because it would feel like she was trying to replace the life she had lost. Everett reminded her that a dream did not belong to the person who first imagined it. It belonged to the person brave enough to finish it. Celeste looked at him with tears in her eyes. She asked what would happen if she failed. Everett told her that failure would simply mean she had finally tried. That afternoon, Celeste made a decision. She would open the studio. Not as a memorial to Graham. Not as an attempt to recreate their old life. But as something that belonged to her. The months that followed were difficult. The studio was small. Money was tight. Clients were uncertain. There were days when Celeste questioned everything. Everett watched her struggle, but he never tried to rescue her. He had learned that loving someone did not mean carrying every burden for them. Sometimes love meant standing nearby while they learned how strong they were. He built her first display table himself. He used the same walnut he had bought after their road trip. When Celeste saw it, she ran her hand across the smooth surface and became emotional. She told him it was beautiful. Everett smiled and said it was only a table. She shook her head. She told him it was proof. Proof that broken things could become useful again. That sentence stayed with Everett. Because he knew she was not talking about furniture. On the day Celeste officially opened her studio, the entire street seemed to show up. Neighbors brought flowers, pastries, coffee, and small gifts. Meredith came too, carrying the old notebook that had started everything. Celeste stood at the entrance, overwhelmed by the people surrounding her. She looked toward Everett. He was standing in the back, quietly smiling. She walked over to him and told him that she never would have opened the doors if he had not invited her on that road trip. Everett shook his head. He told her she had opened the doors herself. She simply smiled and said that maybe all she had needed was someone to remind her that she could. Later that afternoon, when the crowd had thinned, Celeste and Everett sat on the steps outside the studio. The street was warm and bright. Cars passed occasionally, and somewhere nearby, children were laughing. Celeste asked Everett if he remembered the first day of their trip. He said he remembered everything. She reminded him that he had invited her as a joke. Everett laughed. He admitted that he had been terrified when she said yes. Celeste laughed too and told him she had been terrified as well. Then she became quiet. She told him that she had said yes because for 3 years she had been waiting for permission to live again. Everett looked at her. Celeste told him that he had given her that permission without realizing it. Everett admitted that she had done the same for him. Neither of them needed to say what was slowly becoming obvious. Their friendship had changed. It had grown beyond two lonely neighbors who happened to take a road trip together. They had become witnesses to each other's transformation. They had seen each other's worst days, heard each other's fears, and watched each other choose hope when giving up would have been easier. But Everett was still afraid. He had been hurt before. He did not want to mistake gratitude for love. He did not want to become dependent on someone simply because they had helped him heal. Celeste had the same fear. So they moved slowly. They continued working. They continued traveling. They continued having ordinary afternoons together. There were no dramatic promises. No rushed declarations. Just two people learning that something meaningful did not have to begin with certainty. It could begin with trust. One summer afternoon, nearly a year after the road trip, Everett finished building a large dining table for a couple who had recently bought their first home. He carried the final piece into his workshop and stood there admiring it. Celeste walked in carrying 2 coffees. She looked at the table and smiled. She told him it was the best thing he had ever made. Everett said it was not. He said the best thing he had ever made was the decision to leave the driveway on a trip he had originally planned to take alone. Celeste smiled and asked whether he would make the same decision again. Everett looked at her. This time, there was no hesitation. He said yes. Then he asked whether she would come with him again. Celeste smiled. She said she had been waiting for him to ask. They both laughed. But this time, neither of them was joking. The next road trip was different. There was no running away from pain. There was no attempt to escape memories. They were simply going somewhere because they wanted to see what was beyond the next hill. They drove through small towns, stopped at roadside markets, ate lunch beside quiet lakes, and took photographs they would later place inside the studio and Everett's workshop. At one stop, Celeste bought a small wooden sign that read, "The best roads are rarely planned." She gave it to Everett. He hung it above the entrance to his workshop. Years later, whenever someone asked him how his life changed so dramatically, Everett never talked about the divorce first. He talked about a rainy morning, an open passenger door, and a woman who answered a joke as though it were an invitation she had been waiting years to receive. He learned that grief does not disappear. It changes shape. Regret does not vanish. It becomes wisdom. And loneliness does not always need to be defeated by finding someone else. Sometimes it begins to fade when you finally allow yourself to be seen. Celeste learned that moving forward did not mean betraying Graham's memory. Everett learned that forgiving Marissa did not mean forgetting the pain. They both learned that the future does not ask permission from the past. It simply waits for you to choose it. And sometimes, the most important journey of your life begins with something so ordinary that you almost miss its meaning. A neighbor. A driveway. An open car door. A careless joke. And one unexpected answer. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to leave a meaningful comment and share what you believe Everett and Celeste taught each other about healing, forgiveness, and second chances. Your comment may reach someone who is quietly struggling and needs to hear that beginning again is still possible. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Because sometimes we think we are inviting someone to join us for a trip. But life has a strange way of turning that invitation into something much bigger. Sometimes you think you are offering someone a seat beside you. Only later do you realize they were the person who helped you find your way home.